Great to see such a terrific turnout for this conversation. I want to start by acknowledging the Whadjuk Noongar people on whose land we are today, and pay our respects to elders past and present. I want to particularly note that I am from farming background down in the Great Southern at a place called Cranbrook, and you know, when my forebears turned up in Cranbrook, essentially dispossessed the Noongar people in that region and settled our farm. So I have a great personal, I suppose, stake and responsibility in that area. I want to acknowledge the Honourable Alana McTiernan, MLC, Minister for Regional Development and Agriculture and Food, and the Minister assisting the Premier for State Development. Sabine Winton, MLA, Member for Wanneroo, the Honourable Diane Evers, MLC, Member for the South West region. Great to have you here. And of course, Dr. Charles Massey, or I think Charlie might be the preferred handle, author of Call of the Reed Warbler, A New Agriculture, A New Earth, who is our guest today for what I'm sure will be a very interesting conversation. It's great to see Nick Kelly here, who's a farmer from Newdigate. Welcome Nick, and thanks for coming along. Also want to acknowledge the great turnout, the help that we've had from the Perth NRM. Want to acknowledge Trent Kensett-Smith. I'm sure it's a hard one for me to get straight, but relatively new CEO of the WA Farmers Federation. Great to see you here, Trent, Kent. Also want to acknowledge the media representatives here today. I think we've got a number of people dialing in or videoing in remotely, and I just remind you, if you could please put your phones or whatever on silent or on mute would be terrific. So at DPIRD, protecting the productivity and health of our soils so that we have the opportunities in the future that we have in the present is critically important. As I said, I'm from a farming background down south, and my great-grandfather, when he opened up the country, essentially he and my grandfather spent probably the best part of 50 or 60 years clearing a number of farms, and then my father reaped some fairly short-term rewards from farming it, and towards the tail end of my dad's farming career, and certainly my brother's career for the last 25 years, very strong focus on rebuilding some of the challenges that have been set up by the early phase. That said, I think I can say that great progress has been made in both understanding and valuing the health of our soils across our West Australian agricultural zone, and the practices that are in place today, I think, are absolutely better than they had been, in decades past. I think, I want to acknowledge the very good work that this department has done over many decades, the strong network of professional soil scientists who've worked to build that understanding and to make sure that it's shared with farmers so that practice can evolve and improve. So I just want to acknowledge that some of the great work that's done, including things, initiatives such as the Soils West Alliance, which has recently had a win. That said, we can always do better, and there is nothing more important than making sure that we're absolutely on the front foot, thinking creatively and proactively about the long-term health of our farming systems and soils. So discussions like we're having today are very, very welcome, and I acknowledge the Minister's initiative in inviting Dr. Massey to us today. Very much look forward to the conversation and to hearing from Nick afterwards. There will be some time for questions and answers, and I look forward to a very lively debate. And then I think there's a bus tour going to look at some practical applications of some of the ideas that we'll be talking about. So with no further ado, I'll welcome the Minister to come and introduce our guest.
Thanks very much, Rolf. And look, I won't do all the introductions again, but I do want to particularly thank Sabina Winton and Diane Evers for coming along, parliamentary representatives. It's fantastic to see you here. I also want to acknowledge all of those people from the Department of Ag that have come along, primary and primary industry. I know some of you felt that this was perhaps a bit of a re-education camp that the minister was imposing on you, but I say this, that I was down at Texpo in Katanning earlier this year, and the keynote speaker got up and he said, we used to go down to South Perth. He had the agricultural round in the 70s and 80s in the West, and you'd go down to South Perth and it was just full of ideas and excitement brimming over, and you didn't have to work hard for stories, they just sort of leapt out at you. And he said, now, I don't want to be rude, guys, but he did say you go down there now and it is like a morgue. Now, I know you've had many years of attrition. We haven't been able to do anything about the premises yet, but we are absolutely trying to rebuild that esprit de corps and that intellectual excitement in the department, and this is part of it. It is great to see the Farmers Federation here. Trent, you're here. I've got to get the agri-politics right. Want to also acknowledge Doug from the PGA, that they've come along as well. So it's fabulous that we've got that side. We've got a number of fantastic growers here that are doing fabulous stuff, and I'm really very grateful that Nick Kelly has also agreed to speak today. Now, just for those of you that haven't heard the story, right, as how that, I got to be a disciple of our John the Baptist, Charles Massey here, is that I was tricked into going to this long table dinner, which normally it's one of the good things being a food minister. There's these we get invited to these beautiful dinners in fabulous spots in the country, chandeliers, fine wine, that sort of thing. So, when I had one Saturday, I was down in Albany, invited to run the prong ropes, we'll go. And of course, it turned out not actually even to be in a tin shed, just a piece of tin and a big fire, but I have to admit, nice food and very unusual wines. And we, as I froze in my evening gear, this was thrust into my hand by Evelyn Collin, who is here tonight, and a group of farmers surrounded me, and I was made to read this thing. And so I sort of got home to Albany and defrosted. I read it, and it was extraordinary. I have to say, Charles, it is an amazing piece of work. It is truly inspiring. Now, this is not to say that, so what Charles has brought, decades and decades of practical experience, both as an ag scientist and as an intergenerational farmer. But he's been at this thinking, this doing and thinking and reflecting long enough that he has developed, I guess, a perspective from a higher plane. And it would be true to say, Charles, that's made a number of people nervous. I've noticed in this department people get nervous very quickly. And I've had lots of nervousness there, and last night at the GRDC dinner, you've got to be careful, you've got to take people with you. And I'm saying, yes, you do have to take people with you. The guy is not a raving lunatic, he's not a permaculturist. He is someone who is actually done this stuff and thought about it and is able to offer a new perspective. And importantly, what Charles has done in this book is to create inspiration, because part of sometimes to bring people with you, you have to do something different. You have to issue a wake-up call. And I believe that is what Charles has done, and that's why we were so pleased that Charles agreed when he was coming over here for the Writers' Festival, where they had to actually turn away people from his sessions, that he's agreed to come here to talk about the practicality and the reality of this program of regenerative agriculture, but also to do more, to inspire us as to what farming could be if we adopted what I like to think of as deep science rather than superficial science. So again, thank you all very, very much for coming along today. Thank you, Charles, for agreeing to come out here and inspire the troops. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Alana, and through you to the department for asking me here today. The first comment I would make is that John the Baptist ended up with his head on a plate. So I hope we go better than that. And my perspective will be from a practising farmer who's made a lot of mistakes, and then with an academic overlay on that, grounded in research. And I know there's nervousness about this blow-in from the east. I'm coming here today to first of all sketch this future situation we're going into or are already in, and that through wonderful stories of the people I talk to use them as templates to sow ideas of some directions we can take. And the critical one, I think, that's going to connect us is through healthy food into our urban cousins and draw back from there. So that's where I'm coming from. All right, so I thought I'd start with the background situation to where we are. And many of you would be familiar with these stats. So I married a teacher. 70% of we farmers are really only viable due to off-farm income of whatever component. The sobering stat, 2013, the first time over 50% of farm equity owned by banks. All of us know declining terms of trade is a sort of common environmental background to everything we've done. Costs always increasing more than prices. We know we're caught by two big retailers who dominate the industry and drive all sorts of agenda, not to the benefit of farmers. And the social stat that's quite alarming is that compared to their urban cohorts, male farmers have double the suicide rates. Just some basic demographics, because I think anyone who goes for a drive knows what's happening out in the bush, boarded up, shops in towns, abandoned tennis courts, the whole thing. Average age of farmers is 60, slowly climbing. I'm a representative of that. Few of us have intergenerational succession plans, and 50% of us hoping to retire in the next 5 years. And the alarming stat is, off a very low base, on average, there's about 76 farmers leaving the industry every week. As a food exporter, we're incredible. We feed double our own population, and yet at the same time, 10% of our population is food insecure. In other words, they don't know where the next meal is coming from. And 500,000 of them are children. And we're all well aware also that there's plenty of jobs out there for agricultural graduates, but the ag colleges aren't exactly overflowing. Environmentally, we manage collectively, we farmers, 61% of Australia's land mass. But we are presiding over record rates of ongoing biodiversity loss. Still a lot of clearing going on in a number of states. We're very high emissions, high carbon users in our activities. And our efficiency is not overall brilliant. So for every 1 calorie of food on the table, it takes 10 calories of fossil fuel to get it there. And we know there's lots of concern over chemical residues in food and humans. And I don't have to tell cropping farmers, I'm more of a grazier, but weed resistance is an ongoing and cumulative problem. We have structural issues. Our zeal for economic rationalism, driven by the big multinationals, means that we've been open for business, to quote some federal politicians. The alarming thing is that some of the big boys, the big transnationals, are now occupying ownership right across the chain, not just from food growing, exporting it back to their home countries, but a lot of the critical elements in that whole production supply value chain. And as part of that get big or get out syndrome. We hear wonders from the economic rationalists about how good fair trade's going to be. No one's ever fully costed any of the agreements. And you might want to ask some of the milk producers and pig producers what they think of it. I doubt whether they'll give it too many ticks. And then a sobering thing to reflect on when we're being told constantly by a lot of the big multinationals is that we're reliant on them to produce a lot of our food. Actually, 70% of the world's food comes from peasant-based farming with less than 5 acres. Most of them are women, but they're in a patriarchal society without ownership. And these farms, which are invariably agroecological with a lot of diversity, etc., per hectare are more efficient than we are in the so-called developed world. So that's something to think of, and maybe a template to consider, that ecology can play a big role. And hence my point at the bottom, that small farms are better at utilising biodiversity, maintaining landscapes, contributing to local ecologies, and the social health aspect is a big one that I've alluded to already. And then we have a conundrum. We know that most farmers do want to be good custodians, and recent stat is about 95% of farmers undertake some form of natural resource management. And our conundrum is, due to terms of trade issue and seasons and low commodity prices, is that, as the saying goes, you can't be green when you're in the red. And then just going a bit bigger, there's some interesting global threats. Threats or opportunities is the question I'm posing. We know the animal welfare lobby. PETA, I'm in the Merino industry. We might have had a mules-free sheep for a long while, but they're still, to use a polite word, bastards to deal with. All sorts of movements that can be seen as a threat, but I would suggest they're also great opportunities to think outside just a commodity model. And 2 weeks ago, Germany's National Agricultural Strategy aims to target animal welfare, organic farming, and this includes labelling wars. So is this going to be a threat to us, or is it a potential marketing opportunity? And certainly I don't have to tell anyone in the West what India's just done in regard to thumbing its nose a bit at the World Trade Authority, whether it's your pulses and your grains, etc. I know Western Australia's taken a big hit. And my point still resides there, is opportunity or threat? Do we look at something more niche or specific than bulk commodity, possibly, if you're capable of it? It's a well-known stat that 30% of the food in a rich country like Australia is wasted, not only by the cosmetic fetish of the retailers, but what we throw in the bin, it's gone off in the fridge, etc. Now that's starting to be targeted, which means there could be reducing demand because of it. Again, I ask the question, opportunity for more branded niche products, along with the education that goes with it. And just one, could be wild card, maybe not. Recent Chinese Congress, their premier, who I noticed in the paper today is becoming a total autocrat like Massey. Buried in that speech was an important statement which goes back 4,000 years, that they want to become an ecological civilisation. Okay, their backyard's not too clean now, but if they start blocking products coming in that aren't conforming, that's another issue to consider. And again, I'm saying threat or opportunity. So what I'm really saying, there's these threats, there's opportunities. There's some extraordinary stuff going on in what I call the new regenerative agriculture. I don't like the word sustainable anymore. It reminds me of just marking time. Regenerative means going forward using natural processes to something better and more complex, more diverse, etc. And these people are already creating opportunities. There's some remarkable stuff, and I don't think we need to be threatened by it. And I'm saying here are some serious options that need considering as we start hitting the wall in costs and in soils that are getting deader and weed resistant, all those sorts of issues. So that's what I'm floating, constructively, not didactically. So my message today really is from Healthy Landscapes. That's on the left is our temperate tablelands at home, natural grassland. Not to say we're doing it well, but it's representative. Healthy landscapes leads to healthy food and therefore healthy people and healthy planet. And you wonder why I mentioned the last one, which I'll come to directly. So if you look at that snake, we're not in a good position because where I am still attached to the ANU, just down the corridor to me are people like Will Steffen, and across the road, Professor John Finnegan, a lot of the leaders at the very leading levels on the IPCC and other international committees who are getting more depressed by the minute as the information comes in, not just on climate. So to me, it's absolutely incontrovertible, despite what some of our politicians, particularly on the conservative side, think, that we have moved into a new epoch of Earth history. And the story that's not told is not just climate. If you understand about this extraordinary blue-green planet, where life actually created conditions for life, there's about 9 major interrelated operating systems that sustain this self-organising planet, climate being one of them. And you can see the others there: biodiversity integrity, the combination of biogeochemical flows, nitrogen, phosphorus linked, down through land systems. When you start to look at the evidence, the big clearing, and when I'm talking about industrial ag, I mean the worst aspects, whether it's in Brazil, Indonesia, but also Australia's pretty up there. Things like land clearing. When you start to really have a look at the evidence in the papers, industrial agriculture, in its worst aspect, is a major player in affecting 8 of these 9 systems, all except for the ozone layer. The converse to that is, if we start doing it better, we know we can pull down lots of carbon, draw down, fixed long-term carbon. It's being shown everywhere, and I'll give some examples. So I'm saying that at the moment, we're being blamed for some of this. We also can be very much part of the solution. Is it happening? I'm not going to go through these. Every week now, there's more and more papers coming out to show how we're destabilising some of these systems. Not just numbers of scientists, nitrate time bombs, because we've got to bear in mind most of our nitrogen fertilisers comes from fossil fuel. That third one, number 3, the big research in Germany that's just come out, that wasn't on farmland, that was in their nature reserves. And there's an enormous crash in insects, and anyone in agriculture knows the implications of that. So that's sort of an indicator of long-term industrial agriculture, what it's starting to have in an area like that. Monsanto is currently under the pump because of the non-Hodgkinson's and lymphoma big lawsuit. It's going to become an interesting space, this, and methane temperature linkages to the nitrogen. So I'm reiterating what I just summed up, that if the worst aspects of industrial ag is a causative factor in much of what we're seeing in the Anthropocene boundaries, and the top 3 of those boundaries we've crossed into dangerous new territory. Ipso facto, or whatever you want to call it, regenerative ag can be a potential solution, and we've got lots of solutions now emerging that can show. So I guess what I'm saying, we need a new story for our times, because the story of growth and greed, economic rationalism and endless growth is not working, it's trashing the planet. And I'm suggesting regenerative agriculture, as I say in the book, it's ultimately a story about renewing Mother Earth and her systems and our deep codependency on these, because we co-evolved in this landscape, as I'll touch a bit later. So I'm not going to bore you with the book. I don't want to get my head too much on the plate too soon. It's very much a story of hope. It's pretty easy to rattle off all the bad things that's happening in the Anthropocene and what we're doing, and et cetera, but it's really come out of my own experience. I had to leave uni and finish part-time at the age of 22. My father had a heart attack. And growing up on a farm doesn't mean you know anything about management. So I adopted best practice. I spoke to mates in CSIRO, Department of Ag, best farmers locally, and I proceeded down the path of trying to make a profit. But I realise now a lot of my actions, set stocking, ploughing sandy country that was washed away, etc., I still have guilt today at the mistakes I made. And so I'm speaking from my own mistake-ridden learning journey. And then having had a Merino stud where we did some innovative stuff in molecular genetics, etc., a lot of our clients, I had up to 250 or so in 6 states, so I was travelling up to 80,000 k's a year, seeing what was happening to our landscapes. A lot of our clients were what you call the early adopters on that very early phase of the adoption curve. And because of their different mindset, they were the ones getting into regenerative ag. And when I'd visit them, they'd show me stuff. And I was late getting into it because a complex merino stud means you can't manage a landscape as well as you'd like. And so eventually I was so intrigued by this, I went back to uni in the late 50s and really, in human ecology, not just caught up on what I'd missed in 30 years in ecology, but studied why these farmers had changed so radically. And so that's where the book came out of. And I guess the big thing for me, looking at my own journey, I came to realise I was landscape illiterate. I couldn't read a landscape. I didn't know how it functioned. I'd never been taught that. I'd done traditional soil science, which was great, physics and chemistry, and plenty of ag courses, etc. But I actually could not drive through a landscape and see whether it was functioning well, or if it was ill, what was wrong with it. And so what I've then shaped the book around was taking a journey in a model that any farmer could pick up, or anyone, and hopefully give us some ecological literacy and therefore understanding on how really a complex self-organising process works. That's really the guts of the book. It's wonderful stories working through those sorts of issues. So I deliberately chose as many bio regions across Australia as I can in the farming zone, up to over 20, and across the spectrum of what you'd term regenerative agriculture, from holistic grazing, now in, I would guess, millions of acres in Australia, certainly 30 million hectares worldwide in 5 continents. Biological ag, agroforestry, wonderful stuff going on. So, and some of the new cropping developments, even permaculture is there, as was earlier mentioned. When done well, it has merit because it's a design approach to landscape. So really I created, if you like, a tapestry, the warp being lots of stories, because we're made for story about what's going on. And many strands many weft strands, but it was the journey of ecological literacy, which I'll quickly summarise now. So the first point is when Europeans came to this country, they came from the post-glacial environment chocked with nutrients, rich, humid soils of Europe, and applied a technology that didn't apply to the way our landscapes function. I mean, I don't have to tell Western Australians how old and leached your environment is, and we therefore have a lot more collaborative methods of recycling scarce nutrients, whether it's microbial or to do with energy and nutrients in our upper landscapes. So it was totally different. And that was the reason why, as I tell in the book, it took only 15 years in a Western Victorian landscape to totally crash it, from health to complete disaster. You guys will know better than me, 30, 40 years or whatever before salination rises through overclearing and other things. New England dieback took 130 years, but at some stage, if you can simplify complex systems, you can reach tipping points. So I spend time on that. Don't need to belabour that. It's not just Western Australia, it's pretty much in every state, as you now know. And one of the things I tried to get at was, what was this mind that came to Australia that couldn't perceive what was going on, both landscape-wise and in its indigenous people. And if you trace, I'm not going to waste time now, but if you trace the fact from about, say, the Renaissance, especially with indigenous people, but even peasant cultures, they still saw themselves as part of Mother Earth and stayed within her cycles. We then went through the scientific revolution, all that brilliant stuff from Descartes and Newton and all the guys, brilliant work. Capitalist revolution, industrial revolution. The end result of that pretty much was a conversion of that old organic mind, I'm talking about Western society now, to a mind that saw the earth as an inanimate object that you could extract material from for profit. And I'm simplifying it, but that's pretty much was a massive shift. And in the long journey of human history, it's a monumental shift, and is really what's behind what we did and what, in some views, is still going on. And what came out of that, typified by that major advertisement that went around all the major dailies a decade or so ago, that nature became to be regarded in some respects as an enemy, which we were separate from. And if you could to extract maximum product, and this is all logical, and it's how we make and have made money, how I've done it too, simplified, dominated, if necessary you kill it, so you can control what's going on, rather than working with it. But as I point out, in many places we now have got these mounting unsustainable costs across the spectrum, from environmental to social. Certainly in human health, which I'll touch on. And it's our lack of empathy, identification with nature that is an issue. So as I said earlier, our challenge is to go beyond sustainability to a new way of thinking, and I'm suggesting that we can regenerate some of our sickened landscapes, and pathway I'm thinking as a farmer viewing at it is a journey in ecological literacy, which includes science, of course. So that was my problem. Couldn't read a landscape. I was illiterate, just like a dyslexic person, just the way you're wired. And it all comes from that, as one farmer said to me, that 1 square foot of real estate between our ears. It's the way we've been trained and by family or ag college or peers, our worldview of how a landscape works or doesn't work. It's just that power of the paradigm, the worldview. And when some radical Easterner like me gets up and starts to say, maybe we can think about something different, in many of us, and I've been there, the defence barriers come up because it's a threat to the way we function and think. So this is simply the model. I'm not going to waste time because we've got a terrific farmer coming after me who is a classic illustration in Nick of lateral thinking. But essentially, and this is nothing different to what a lot of the good scientists in this room would know, solar function fundamental. Putting those sugars into the ground to drive all the processes of life. Water cycle, the soil mineral cycle, whatever you want to call it. You can put different names on this, biodiversity or dynamic ecosystems. The thing that I've added to the model, which people like Alan Savory didn't have, is that square foot of real estate issue, the human social. And the point I want to emphasise is the interconnection. You can't fiddle around with one of these fundamental functions without destabilising the others. They're all intimately interconnected. And it goes without saying, when you look at the history of 24 or whatever it is, collapsed human civilisations, it's these principles here that underpin human civilisations. And we're one of the many that thinks it's inviolable from that rule. But the way we're going, we'll join the queue if we're not careful. And the other thing that really impacted me when I went back to university, I had to catch up on 30 years or more in the new ecological thinking. And a lot had come out of the computer world. And as many of you here are aware, the systems thinking, soft systems thinking. And so when I had to turn around and teach master's students and second and third years, I really tried to get my head around what we now call complex adaptive systems. And a few things stood out because there's about 12 components, but the one that really impacted me is this concept that these complex systems, whether it be a farm or a landscape, World Wide Web, whatever, if they're destabilised but then left to it, they will equilibrate using, if you like, experimental things called emergent properties. They will equilibrate back to a state of health. And I kept hearing from farmers, and I thought about this for a couple of years before I realised what they were saying. Look, my job is to get out of the way of Mother Nature, let her get on with it. And what they were really saying was, my job is to let self-organising processes take hold again, which we've destabilised. And so that really became, for me, it just made so much sense as a new worldview that we can confront the issues that are in front of us. So quickly, I'll skate through these. A lot of people in this room talk about this a lot better than I will, but in a nutshell, our role as managers is to have as many of those solar panels, photosynthetic drivers of plants year-round as much as we can, putting more and more sugar into the ground to drive the biology, etc., etc. And this is obviously the key one, affecting all the other cycles. So if you look at some of the holistic grazers, I could show you photos of 30,000 sheep in a mob, 2,000 cattle. All sorts of crazy stuff going on to replicate the African herd model where the ideas came from. But essentially what they're trying to do is have as many green channels on the ground, whether they're C3, C4 grasses to cover the seasons, or forbs and herbs and shrubs. There's much of that function ongoing for 12 months, rather than bare ground or whatever. And that's what a lot is behind a lot of the multi-stacking in cropping, from the gay browns in the States to the coloncisers and others. So it's diverse function of roots and microbial stimulation and all sorts of other things going on. But it's essentially keeping as much green as you can. Now, I visited this guy in the Karoo, a bit like some of the pastoral country. Stayed with Norman Croon. That paddock on the right is his neighbour now. When he bought that country, the 70s, that's what all this country was like. And we're talking about country that 400 years ago had rivers full of hippopotami. He had to walk a kilometre to find a perennial. And just by shifting his grazing, using this here, that came out of the savoury system, that's his country today. Tripled his production, huge variety of forbs and shrubs and plants, grasses, and you can see how soft the ground is by the wheel tracks. There's plenty of examples. North Queensland, Terry McCosker's group, RCS, that's 10 years. That bent tree in the top photo, you can see it middle ground further back, so that's the monitoring site. Again, big lifts in production, solar cycle working, and therefore the water cycles, the water doesn't run off compacted ground, da-da-da. And that gully down there, that was once steep and active. In 10 years, it's now starting to heal itself, and the animal hooves are the healing property, given adequate rest, etc. So there's lots of these photos around of remarkable transformation. These radicals here have shifted what people like Wes Jackson in America, the Land Institute, are trying to breed perennial grains. They're not getting there. These fellas, Colin Sice and Maynard, for example, said, well, why don't we grow crops in dormant C4 grasses through the winter when using the edible grazing crops and canolas. Yes, the yields aren't as much, but their resilience and long-term profitability, and they're running animals across that landscape, a lot more production from meat and fibre. So that's their approach to it. Water cycle, I'm not going to go through all the points. Basically, everyone knows we've got to change the structure of our soils, get away from compaction, get types of plants that punch holes in, get more air pockets and the whole thing. The point I want to make down the bottom right, an effective water cycle requires active management. It doesn't happen on its own, especially if country's degraded. It won't self-organise back to full health without some intervention. And that's what's happening there. I'll repeat that photo. Once the country was given rest on the right, and the C4s and the shrubs weren't overgrazed, the roots started to go deeper, and his water retention, it only took him 3 years to start holding in an equivalent rain 3 times more water on his country instead of it racing off. And I've been to places, worked in Myanmar, where you've just got sand rivers now due to climate change because of overgrazing goats and sheep. What can you do with the water? When you get your water system right, that blue arrow is the same point in that landscape. This is in Mexico. And that's after 27 years of changing management from set stocking. And that landscape on the right, I would guess, probably got 1,000 times more water held in its soils, at least, than the one on the left. So that's why it's called regenerative. Soil mineral cycle, I'm not going to go through that. There's people here who can speak to it a lot better than I can. But the thing that I tended to miss repeating a soil science course when I went back to a particular university recently, they still weren't teaching biology. There's still physics and chemistry, and we know how important cation exchange capacity and all that is. But to me, the biggie is the microhyals fungi and the bacteria and everything, that whole zoo that's working, which is the one that helps lay down the carbon and feeds the whole system. And again, the point at the bottom, it's our management that can drastically affect the speed, efficiency and complexity of the cycling of these minerals, because that zoo is dog eat dog and the minerals are always being recycled, etc. So that was our old approach. As a young and stupid student, I used to do a lot of mountaineering. I remember climbing in the upper Tasman in New Zealand and came across red ice, and the Kiwi guide said, his words were, that's your bloody Mallee drought of the 30s. We lost millions of tonnes, 4,000 k's out of Broken Hill, South Australia, the Mallee country, and that's happened on 4 occasions. you can see how much soil we've lost there, and that's from soils that weren't exactly chock full of nutrients. It's not just the past. When I was travelling across the head of the Liverpool plains to visit a guy just below that Blue Range, 2011, and these are some of the best soils in Australia, even in the world. It was a dry season and they'd had 8 mils the previous night, and I had to stop. There's water still lying on these deep black soils. So I hopped the fence and it was crusted, powdery. It had been so overworked with machines and so over-fertilised and over-sprayed. They were just totally dead and they'd lost structure. And when I went back and visited the guy at the top, he took me for a drive at the head of the plains, and there were cattle grids a metre above the rest of the soil at that stage. So, and that's just, it's not deliberate, it's lack of knowledge of how that landscape function behaves. And I just picked this out of the Weekend Australian the other day, a familiar scene, not just in Western Australia, but everywhere, what happens in the summer. That ain't doing the soil biology or the soil softness, etc., too much good. And I've done that. It's a matter of maybe seeing if we can find better ways of doing it. So an analogy I use, we really should be thinking about an iceberg shape for our, a lot more life under the ground than above the ground when you get a really healthy soil. And some recent research, when you do start getting it right, carbon, etc., this guy called Morris, and put in an extra 1% of carbon, potentially will hold at least another 140,000 litres of water per hectare. It's quite profound, and that's why a lot of the regenerative farmers have year-round green, much greater production, much greater resilience. There's a couple of bush rangers in this room. I think what the Haggertys are doing out in really marginal country is world breakthrough stuff, driving it with extraordinarily innovative biology, non-ending innovation, but using animals. It's a pretty good rule of thumb that if you can have animals with their own rumen microflora that interacts, grazing properly, not overgrazing, so you get some die-off of carbon, but not too much, it's an essential component, and I'm sure you're aware of them, and they're around for later questions, but I think it's world breakthrough stuff applying in continents worldwide in marginal country, let alone good country. Won't belabour the point here. We all know in Western Australia there's wonderful work going on in biodiversity stuff. Pest control, parasitic wasps, birds, the whole thing, integral function in a healthy landscape. And, fiddle around with one of those components like trees, you get whacked. Now, one of the leaders, I think, in social learning between farmers is a guy called Rowan Reid, used to lecture at Melbourne Uni, founded the agroforestry course. And he bought this farm in the 80s. Top left, it was eroded, active erosion. He then planted strategically farm forestry, but driven by a farming vision, not a monoculture forestry. So that culvert you can see top left, that roadway is over that culvert 2010, and that's the same culvert where he's now harvesting a beautifully pruned hardwood log. And he and his compatriots, there's 200 now, regenerated this whole catchment. They're stacking in 8 or 9 different economic enterprises. Their resilience, their profitability, their health's gone through the roof. And agroforestry can be done in many places. And one of the other things I was privileged to work, probably with world leader in putting edible shrubs in a natural landscape where you have shrubs anyway that animals graze, is Professor Fred Provenza from Utah State. I'm not going to belabour it, but Western Australians have been at the forefront with evergreen, with the Eutagastaceae legumes with high protein, year-round feed, etc. And that's just one example, but it has big implications for health of livestock because of the tens of thousands of phytochemicals, the secondary chemicals that you'll find in shrubs and not necessarily in grasses, and I'll touch on that later. But you've got a vertical layer, worm eggs, animal worm eggs don't sit on that, different nutrients, and I'm telling you guys to suck eggs. There's a lot of good stuff going on here. Spaniards and the Portuguese have been doing it for centuries, and putting in 8 or 9 different enterprises, including the most world famous ham, yamon, that comes out of the the acorn country. And people like Dean Revell, who I've worked with, departments of ag here and all over the place, have hammered this message for yonks. Shade and shelter, protecting soil and animals, off-shears sheep. As we're getting hotter and hotter, shade's going to become more imperative, animal welfare issues. It's a no-brainer as well. So we come to the biggie, which is that square foot of real estate, the paradigms and mental models, and that's what precludes us gaining ecological literacy. I've been there. And that's a fence line at home between two neighbours, different worldviews. Sort of speaks volumes, doesn't it? And so I guess what I'm saying, I think the big engine that's now driving a lot of the work by these regenerative farmers is this enablement of nature to get on with it if we back off and let it do it. There's the short and long grass prairies in the States, South America, South Africa and Australia. Once you get a thing like holistic grazing going and you get deep soils and insects going down, long lost seed from species no one's seen for over 100 years suddenly starting to appear. Nature starts to reorganise back to a system that has co-evolved for, and the microbial communities, the microhealth of fungi and others start coming back as well. And give her a chance. She's a lot smarter than we are. And I'm suggesting that approach, that broad thinking of allowing self-organisation to work is the way we've got to confront what we're doing in agriculture towards some of these Anthropocene boundaries. And this is the biggie I'd sort of want to really finish with. People forget that over hundreds of thousand years in the savannah, we co-evolved in that landscape. So the women would have been gathering up to 500 medicinal food plants with all their nutrients. The hunters were hunting game, who were grazing lots of plants with thousands of phytochemicals in them. And so our organs, our alimentary canal, our gut, and our brain is linked to identifying our shortages in key nutrients. We've denied that without mentioning any brands or approaches. We do ignore this long co-evolved history at our peril. And our trek to evolution could be interesting if you portray it different ways, but that is a sad reflection on where our society is going as we become divorced from truly healthy food off healthy landscapes. So just to give you an example, if we get animals into a diverse shrub landscape, as the work of Fred Provenza and them have shown, it's tens of thousands of phytonutrients out there. Not just phenolics and terpenes and alkaloids. We're using native wattle species at home because of the tannins for animals to self-medicate on, anti-anthelmintics, things like that. There's huge opportunities and for animal health, etc., and well-being. So really, for herbivores eating a variety of foods in a variety of places, it's got huge consequences for us because we're co-evolved to eat some of those animals. I'm probably going to tread on some vegan toes and stuff, but I think they're denying the co-evolved biological history of our species. And if we can get onto animal products, plants obviously, but also animal products off healthy landscapes, we're going to address a lot of modern disease issues that derived from us not getting the right nutrients. And there's enough research now to show that if we push the industrial model too far, aim for too much production and too much dependency on man-made inputs, you end up with really effectively drug addict plants. And the evidence is now showing that the key nutrients are dropping in the wheats. These high yield input responsive cultivars now starting to miss some critical elements, including things like selenium, etc., magnesium, integral to our cell function, our immune function. There's more and more work coming out on that. It's coming out also on our vegetables and fruits. Earlier work since industrial ag really got going after the World War, and now latest research, even bigger decreases in nutrients right across the food chain. And essentially, what's happening, we've got a 140-year-old mulberry tree at home, and I allow people to eat that and try some of the big high-production modern mulberries. One's bland, tasteless, the other's chock full of nutrients, even if it's got less. It's just all about taste. etc., is all about the package and variety of nutrients in food. It's a really good indicator. And we eat a lot of crap today that's pretty tasteless. And just to give you an example, the reason I think that we haven't really got across this is it's hugely expensive to try and identify the hundreds of nutrients in some of these compounds. And if you look at, say, the primary compounds in spinach, your minerals, vitamins and stuff, out of a healthy soil, there's well over 100 that Provenza and some of the human nutritionists he worked with analysed. Same with oregano out of a healthy food in healthy soil and secondary compounds. It's mind-boggling what's there out of healthy soil where you've got your fungi, hyphae accessing it and everything working properly. And that's being denied if we're not careful, if we overdo the high input sort of approach or kill off the soil with the wrong treatments. So, nearly 2,500 years ago, this guy who gave the medical profession its ethical base, Hippocrates, said this: "Let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food." I'm sure you've all heard that, but that's what I've just been trying to talk about. And of course this all has important marketing opportunities, and this is the one that's probably going to get me in most trouble, but there's an enormous amount of evidence now to show that there's an emerging major problem with glyphosate, Roundup. We're nearly putting out 1 million tonnes worldwide now, and the evidence is starting to mount. It's been repressed for obvious reasons for a while. Lots of papers. This is one paper where these guys reviewed over 280 papers, medical, biomedical field. We know from other soil scientists major damage to soil biota, insidious impact, etc., etc. The main thing that's now emerging is glyphosate blocks the Shikimati pathway in our gut microbial communities, where amino acids are synthesised. In other words, it hits our entire immune system, the major driver of our immune system. And if you look at the ramp up in chemicals from the late 80s and 90s, the parallel curve with things like immune resistant, related diseases, the ADDHs, asthmas, allergies, pretty high correlation. And so the red there is they are now postulating maybe the most significant environmental toxin and most biologically disruptive chemical in our environment. And the evidence is still coming, and Monsanto's now under court case, and the judge forced them to release lots of documents which showed that covered up cancer and stuff. So I'm not making a bogey out of them. I think, if you want my opinion, I think this could be bigger than tobacco. I really do. And I think keep your eye on this very clearly. So, in short, you can't damage what you're dependent upon without damaging yourself, which is what Wendell Berry's wonderful quote. And so very quickly, I don't know how we're going for time. Okay, Ralph? 6 minutes. Just to give you an idea, this is one of the first farmers in Australia been studied on putting carbon in the ground. The scientists found that they've sequestered 11 times more carbon in the ground than their total farm emissions in that period, taking their carbon from 1% to 4%. So it's doable, and they did that just through clever planting and better pasture management. So it's achievable. Hopefully one day we'll be able to be paid, and there's people here know a lot more about this than me, but at the moment the damn New South Welshmen and Queenslanders are running off with $100 million of carbon credits. You guys have got huge potential for this, and I know the Minister and people in this department are awake to, you don't have to change acts, as I understand, to maybe open up huge opportunities, and with some regenerative management and planting. This can be really freeing for farmers that are under the debt pressure load. If they can start putting away carbon credits and get mutual benefit through regeneration, it's big stuff. Other opportunities which I raised early, keep your eye on this movement to corporate social responsibility. Guys like Larry Fink, BlackRock Investments, 6.3 trillion in the portfolio now to be put towards ethical investments, including in agriculture. We know wealth in Asia is increasing, which means they will be requiring branded, better product. People here would know better than me, once some of your grains get to a certain level, even the prime hards, there's a switch over occurs into high value protein meat. Well, why can't Western Australians get that high value branded product? Yeah, plenty of reasons, maybe not, but I'm just throwing the ideas around. And we now have one of the world's big brands, hitherto in clothing, outdoor clothing, Patagonia. They're now just setting up an office in Australia to certify regenerative farming food products. So things are starting to happen. And look, I won't waste time on that except to say that ruminants in all landscapes are integral to their health. It's an old rule of thumb. Sir Albert Howard said it back in the 30s, the founder of new biological agriculture, and that in turn opens up market opportunities. And there's some really interesting stuff on mutton and lamb's bone that we haven't even looked at. We're as a society have gone off offal, but that's where a lot of the nutrients and the fat in the offal are concentrated, and we've got this cultural resistance to it. But if we want health, we might want to think about using them. So, just to wrap up. I'm the wrong generation for fluid technology operation here. It's dramatic. We're standing on the edge. I really do believe we are standing on the edge as a species as we go into the Anthropocene, especially given the political leadership around the world. We are in a phase of Earth's history now that makes world wars look like chicken feed. We really are. And people in this room, whether they're researchers supporting farmers, we're some of the people, as well as consumer decisions, that can make a difference. So we could get depressed about it and all go down to the pub and sing Monty Python's Galaxy songs. So remember, when you're feeling very small and insecure, how amazingly unlikely is your birth, and pray that there's intelligent life somewhere in space, because there's bugger all down here on Earth. Obviously, I don't believe that. I really do think those of us in this room are in a position to make a difference. And so I'm saying agriculture will be front and centre to our futures. Yeah, we're part of the problem, but we're also going to be a big part of the solution. And it's what I've been hammering all along. That solution is enabling healthy landscapes to self-organise back to health. And Donald Worcester, wonderful environmental historian, laid down 3 principles for good farming: making people healthier, promoting a just society, if you think about food insecurity, and preserving the earth and its network of life. And so by turning these challenges that I've outlaid into opportunities, we can build soil organic carbon. We know we can do that with good practice. We can regenerate the functions, create new enterprises and opportunities, and build greater economic, social and environmental resilience. And just to finish on another note, attributed to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, that I think it reflects on all of us to think about that the ultimate test of a moral society is the sort of world we're going to leave to our children, and I've got grandchildren, and that's something to really think about. So look, I'll call it there because we've got a wonderful farmer to come up in a minute, but thanks very much again to the Minister and the Director for this opportunity, and hope we can have some constructive discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's a real honour to be invited to speak today. For those of you who don't know where Newdigate is, it's about halfway between Perth and Esperance. We're in a medium rainfall district, about between 15 16 inch rainfall. It's one of my hobbies. It's another one. That's another one. This was some of our mid-harvest activities this year. We had a harvest fire started in the neighbours, burnt about 1,600 hectares, and that was a wheat crop there. And that little patch, well, that big patch of trees on the left is our house, and we managed to stop it about 3 metres away from the house. That was a pretty wild day. Hollands Track Farm was cleared by my father in 1965. The farm was primarily wheat and sheep until we sold all the sheep about 20 years ago. We were early adopters of the minimum till knife point movement, and we proceeded to crop the whole farm. The system we were in had a high dependence on chemicals, synthetic fertiliser, and we had some good times. We had some good yields. We soon had some issues developing. Some of you will recognise these weeds. This is a picture taken late 90s or early 2000. This is a really robust stand of wild radish. And this is ryegrass and wild radish. And this is what we were confronted with, and despite a rigorous spraying program, weed issues became worse. We had some resistance issues as well. And around this time we were influenced by some speakers that the Western Australia No-Till Farmers Association brought to some of their conferences, like Rolf Dirch from Paraguay, Dwayne Beck from Dakota Lakes Research Facility, Rick Bieber from South Dakota. Later on we began to follow the work of Dr. Christine Jones from Australia, Amazing Carbon, Elaine Ingham, Soil Food Web, Jill Clapperton, Gabe Brown of Brown's Ranch, to name a few. And all of these people spoke about imitating natural systems, total soil cover, something growing all year round, and zero soil disturbance and diversity. So we've certainly still got some soil constraints. It's just making a mockery of that tillage radish, so we've certainly still got some issues. So early on in the piece, we've been chipping away at this, and I do apologise, I'm going to move quickly because I'm going to unpack about 10 years in 10 minutes. We started experimenting with multi-species cover crops, and this is an example of one of those. What we really needed to find was what would grow in our environment during summer, because we wanted to follow those principles and we wanted to cover the soil all year round, so we needed to know what would grow in Newdigate. There was really no one to ask because no one had been doing it before. This is the same crop a little bit later on, and there's a whole concoction going on in here. You can see sunflowers, there's white French millet in there, there's Dolichos lab and cowpeas. And these have great potential in our environment for cash crops as well. This is we've had quite a dry summer where we are. This is this year. We've been experimenting with things like safflower as well, and there are plenty of things that we can grow. One of the plants we started off with was white French millet, and that's really been a good pioneer species for us. It's got an amazing root system, as you can see. It's highly water use efficient and thrives in some of our sandier soil types. Since introducing cover crops, we no longer need to spray weeds in summer. We've replaced our weeds with beneficial plants, and we keep our biology cool, housed and fed during the hot summer months. These subtropical C4 plants will senesce naturally in our climate and make way for winter crops. This is an example of a millet cash crop, so these have great potential in our environment as well. That's swathing some millet for harvest. Should also mention, due to the constant cover of the cover crops and using zero tillage, erosion has been reduced to almost zero. Water infiltration is improving all the time, and our soil's capacity to hold water is increasing exponentially. It's been occurring to me over the last 10 years that lack of water isn't actually our problem where we are, it's actually soil health. Our soil structure is improving with constantly growing plants, and we can access all plants with machinery very soon after large rainfall events without getting bogged. This is a compost with the addition of compost worms in 2014. We gave up using synthetic phosphate fertiliser. We apply this as an extract at sowing, and we use it as foliar spray as well. It's quite a simple process to extract the biology of this. So we're shifting our focus from feeding plants to feeding soil. We put our own composting worms into that compost just to add value. And we're also, this is the old super shed housing the compost, and we've got some sprinklers in there to keep it damp if we need to, and we can apply our biological food sources to that pile of compost. And we're looking at closing the loop at the moment and making our own. We've been doing a bit of experimenting with that, just from resources and local waste. This is a compost extractor. All it is an 8,000 litre tank with a hopper on the front, with an agitator inside. It's got a big outlet on one side to release the solids, and it's got 2 rows of 4 filters that go from very coarse to very fine. It's a really simple process of extracting the biology. The reason there's 2 banks of filters there is so that you can flush on the run. So it's a quite quick process. This is a 1890 John Deere disc drill. And it's just showing you the liquid applicators on that machine, and that liquid can be squirted straight on top of the seed at sowing time. It's a pretty long rig. This is an example of a multi-species winter crop, or the seed. So we're now growing multi-species winter cover crops in winter as well. And just to give you an example, I did have it written down somewhere, but I've misplaced it. But I think I can see what's in there. It's pretty much everything we grow, plus some other bits and pieces as well. But there's lupins, oats, wheat, barley, field peas, vetch, cereal, rye. Might have missed a few there. Gives you the general idea. Some of you may have seen this before. This is a chart that explains or gives you a bit of an indication as what to throw in a cover crop mix and how to determine what to put in a cover crop mix when you're considering growing the next crop. And this is just an example of a multi-species winter cover crop. This is my son Jude and I getting our nutrients. As the multi-species cover crop cycles nutrients from different depths in the soil profile, it attracts a diversity of biology, builds carbon, improves water infiltration, houses and feeds biology, just to mention a few functions. This is, I won't unpack this at the moment, but this is our cropping rotations, and the main thing that you can take away from that is diversity. We're companion planting, so there's not many crops that we now grow as monocultures. In fact, this year every crop we grow will have at least a companion plant with it. And I'll get into the perennial component shortly. Here's an example of an oat field pea companion crop, which works really nicely. There's a beneficial symbiosis between compatible plants. In our experience, insect pressure is far less of an issue when different species are grown together. I'd call this a success, although it's good to have markets organised before you go ahead with this kind of venture, because they can be hard to get difficult to get rid of if people don't know what they're if they don't understand the benefits of growing two plants together. You can just see the tendrils of the field peas crying out for help. I'll just skip through a few of these. This is a summer companion of Sorghum Sudan and lupins and white French millet, which will be grazed shortly. And this is a lupin millet crop which is about to be harvested, well, in about 3 weeks. For grain growers, some of you have probably seen this graph before, and Charlie touched on it, and I think this is pretty concerning for grain growers when we're looking at the world population versus the real wheat price. Here's some wheat established under lots of cover and residue. This is a maize wheat crop. This is a maize wheat crop in our system. This is a scope barley crop, no pre-emergent herbicide. See a lot of residue and a lot of volunteer millet. Every year I lead an expedition through the Fitzgerald River National Park. It's about 300,000 hectares. And the reason I threw that in there, other than just interest, is in this environment we can still see the same principles that we're applying to our farm. There's total ground cover. There's huge diversity. There's things growing all year round, and there's zero tillage. This is that same barley crop at a later phase, and I haven't got time to go into the frost, but our neighbours were getting absolutely nailed the year this was taken. We had very little frost damage as a wheat crop. We have soil aggregates beginning to form. We're pulling up to 13 earthworms out of the soil in this spot. 13 earthworms per shovelful. We're trialling dryland corn where we are as well. Sorghum Sudan. This is Sorghum Sudan that's been harvested, a lupin crop planted, and then the lupin crop harvested, and the Sorghum Sudan goes again. So there's lots of ways of companion planting. This is what harvest looks like on our farm. That air seeder is kept right up with the harvesters. So we're constantly planting, filling all of the gaps. This is a millet crop and a field pea lupin crop. And we watch those lupins nodulate all summer long, surprisingly, under the canopy of those cover crops. This is volunteer millet under a lupin crop, which is a really good scenario for us because it means we don't have to go and plant it. This is a perennial system. I don't think I've got time to go into this. All right, we're out of time. So I'm just going to skip forward here. We've brought cattle into the system as well, so we have somebody permanently grazing, holistically grazing livestock over the property. I just wanted to touch on the power of cover crops. There was a slide just before that showed a lot of weeds. Where we have a cover crop, we can suppress weeds for a long time. This is, I've just about finished, but this is a lupin crop last season. This is no knockdown herbicide, so no Roundup, no spray seed, direct drilled, no pre-emergent herbicides. This is the same lupin crop. So this year we'll have all of our cropping with no Roundup, no knockdowns, and we got here by adhering to those principles. Zero tillage, a lot of diversity, plants growing all year round, and total soil cover. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
My name's John Hamblin. I've been involved in agriculture since 1962. I'm fascinated by your book. I bought it, by the way, and read it. And I bought it partly because my wife's farm has reed warblers. The thing which I find so interesting about your book, I think from a pasture point of view, you're spot on. The one thing which slightly concerned me was that you're talking about very small paddocks. Now, if you take the example behind you, the machinery that we need today cannot take small paddocks, and you actually gave some very nice examples in your book of that you can scale this right up. And one was the satellite picture from NASA in Africa. So it seems to me that you don't necessarily need small paddocks to make the system work. Now the next question, or the question I have, and I think the second speaker may well have answered that, is if you look at the amount of nitrogen you're carrying off, not what you're putting on, but what you're carrying off, in animal production systems at 10 DSE per hectare, you're carrying off per year about 6 kilos of N, which is very, very little, and natural systems in the soil should be able to produce that. Now, if you're growing a 2-ton wheat crop, you're taking off in the crop 35 kilos of N, and that's more problematic. I would like you to, either of you or both of you, to comment on that. Now, 2 tons is roughly where we're at in Australia, but the good farmers will be getting 4 tons, and they'll be taking off 70 kilos. And so you're going to run into an issue here with nutrition on crops.
I'm not going to wade into the nitrogen one because there's people in this room know a lot more about it. The paddock size area, the reason for you can handle a big paddock issue with electric fencing. That's pretty simple, and probably in time reality fencing. The reason I'm saying that is, as you are aware and as I explained, it's Alan Savory who evolved it, but it's been refined in Australia after that. He observed those vast African herds and wondered why the grasses were so healthy, because it was massive animal impact, urine dung, trampling, and then a lot of rests, because what set stocking does, as we all know, they eat out the most palatable plants. So not all of us can run 5,000 sheep, especially at mating time, etc., etc. And a way to get that equivalent animal density is to increase density through smaller paddock sizes, electric fencing and stuff. So that's, if I'm addressing your question, that's the issue there. It's electric fencing and other issues, you can change that quite quickly. But I'll pass over the big question to Nick.
Thanks, Charlie. We do fix nitrogen through legumes, and I think legumes are a really important part of our system. Certainly, we also pump carbon all summer long with those with the cover, and we also fix nitrogen through the liquid carbon pathway as well all summer, even though some of those are grasses. So I don't have an issue with a lack of nitrogen in our system. In fact, I'm seeing crops start to perform better the further we get into it. In the transition, certainly I did see a decline in yield.
And so when you say in the transition you saw a decline in yield, but you're seeing those yields come back again, is that right?
Yep.
And some of the comments you make, Nick, are about you've also got to look at your input and your output costs. So your input costs have also reduced, have they?
Yeah, so we focus on profit at the moment rather than yield, and we probably always will, but our cost of production is so low that we can take that hit in yield quite easily.
We're aware of ENU, the Ecological Management Unit. It's so refreshing to see the concept come back. We did a lot of work with it under the Gascoyne Murchison strategy back in the late 90s. And Hugh Pringle and his other mate from Calm did a lot of good work, and you'll be pleased to know that the pastoralists really embraced it. And he was able to unlock the landscape in a way that no one has ever been. It's great to see this kind of thing come back. I think it's got a great application. I'm just so happy to see it come back.
Now we actually do have a pastoralist here from Three Rivers. We have a couple. Did you want to?
Ben Forsyth, Three Rivers Station, about 1,000 k's north up on the head of the Gascoyne. It's not really a specific agricultural one, but going to what you were saying about, I think in the room there's a lot of early adopters and pioneers and the rest, but your thoughts on moving, not those people, but the followers. How do we get the bulk of people picking up on these things?
There'll be a lot of people in this room would identify with that question if you're into extension. It's the big one. What impresses me about not just the grazing but the cropping and stuff, there's the issue in you stick your neck out and it's lonely and you're often the pioneer in a district. You need some social support, and they're really good operators in grazing and now cropping, agroforestry. It's what's called social learning, mutual support from farmers who drive the learning agenda for farmers. And as Nick said, you go into it as you're getting your systems going, there is a decline in production. A lot of people will drift off then, they need support. So I don't know what you've described, the resource consulting services, the Otway Agroforestry, the HM group, they play a multi-role of functions in nursing people through change. If you're talking about the next phase in the adoption curve, which is early majority. It's interesting, I noticed in Merino breeding and in other forms of agriculture, and a lot of that adoption work came out of the electronics industry in the States, and it seems to be the early adopters is an 8 or 12%, they'll grab it quickly, not counting the innovators. Then there's what they now call the chasm. To bridge that gap is hugely difficult, and so in other words, you need a different technology to what attracts the more early adopter types, and I think it's my experience of people that made the transformative flip. It was some sort of life shock. In 60% of the cases, they cracked their mind open and made them more receptive, and it's how that comes about. And some people are more naturally inclined to that. Other people, our paradigm is very deep and it's very hard to do. So I'm not going to answer that easily here. All I can say is I think that is the big question. It's not the early adopters. They will always be in there experimenting, some of them too early, too fast. And it's really, I think, through a sort of form of osmosis and days like this and more and more field days around the traps, there's more people in a region adopt it and who hold the respect of others. That what we certainly don't want is what has occurred holier than thou self-righteousness, which is a big turn-off as well. It's when we're dealing with natural transformation, it's humility that we need with the thing. But I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a hugely complex sociological area.
And to what extent do you think, Charles, that some of that consumer drive might come into question here? I was very surprised. I was in Germany over Christmas to see that glyphosate was a very big issue there, and it was even affecting whether or not the CDU and the SDP would form government. Yet it's doesn't really, outside a very few very environmentally conscious people, it's not really a consumer issue here. So is that something that you see that will be one of those things that perhaps will get the chasm thinking about it?
I think there's no doubt in our cost price squeeze issue, if we start to get transparent market signals coming through, because my youngest daughter, for example, is working in the Melbourne urban food area, and there's a huge upsurge of interest, urban gardens, the whole community process. If we can tap into that and a demand-driven food comes back from that, that's going to be one of the signals. We need others, but and I think when you start to hear the stories of Nick and Haggerty's and others, there's a lot of good dollars and cents in some of these new practices, and the main one being a huge slashing in overheads and greater resilience to frosts and harvest. Downgrading of harvest into feed wheat if it's a wet harvest because of too much nitrogen, and a whole combination of things. A natural system tends to have greater resilience, and so there's a whole lot of signals there that if they're made more widely known are going to help people rethink at least. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Now, yes, I am going to, the gentleman over there's got a question, but we are going to do a bit of affirmative action. Madam.
Hi, Louise Edmonds from Intuit Earth. My question's to Nick. Over the last 3 times I've heard you speak, the first time you said that you felt you would be able to get off the herbicides in about 10 years. Last time I spoke to you, you said 3 to 5 years. And today, are you saying that you haven't used any herbicides this year?
We're still using some.
Yeah.
Yep, still certainly using some. We're not quite there. It's still certainly my goal. My goal was when my son was old enough to farm that we wouldn't be using any herbicides. But I'm just realising the power of natural systems and cover crops and what they can achieve for you, and I think perhaps we can get there sooner, certainly. Yep.
And can you just give us some idea of the volume reduction that you've experienced? So you are using some, but if you can you give us some idea of the quantum?
We're probably down now by at least 60%.
From where you started?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, that's great. Thank you. Sorry, gentleman over there, yes. With the gentleman with the beard and the yellow shirt.
Ian Pritchard from DPIRD. I'm just interested in how you are establishing your summer crops, because you've got great looking crops, and by the way, it's a great looking lupin crop because I'm a fan of legumes. So how are you doing it? Without rain, we have problems.
For summer cash crops, they need to be in the ground quite early. For us, it'd be late August, early September. But for summer cover crops, sown at harvest, I think the system we're in is compounding. So the only way to increase the size of our bucket or our water holding capacity is to grow carbon at depth. And the only way to grow carbon at depth is to have a living plant in the soil all year round. So it's a little bit of chicken before the egg. We just put the seed in the ground every year, and when it rains, it comes up. Sometimes when we first started, it may not have achieved much, but it was doing the job. We were still fixing carbon. Now we are confident just to put the seed in the ground, and it always comes up and it never dies. And every year it gets easier and easier and easier to establish green cover.
Incredible. Any other ladies there with a question? Sorry, yes.
I know today's about hope and optimism and all of that, but I just thought I'd ask Nick about some of the pain and heartache that you've gone through over the years, because it's an amazing story and great to hear. Thank you.
It's certainly a moving target, and the only way we get to where we are now is through failure. So we just have to learn to fail really well.
So, Nick, can I just clarify this? Because this is sort of something I think Charles referred to when people go through the hard spot. So did you know that it was going to get, like when you started to see your margins drop and your yields drop and your margins drop, how did you keep faith? Were you aware that this was a process? Were you very conscious that this almost inevitably was something that was going to happen while you transitioned?
I probably didn't realise that it was going to be quite as difficult as it's been, purely because in our region there's no one to ask. So we were really just out on a limb doing what we were doing. But I think for me, the best answer was, well, the surest way to success is just to look at what God's already doing and join in. So we were looking at principles already, functioning around our environment, around our farm, and just replicating those.
Right, excellent. Okay, now I think last question. Yes, Doug.
Doug Hall from Pastures and Graziers. Doug Hall from Pastures and Graziers. Thanks very much, Charles and Nick, for your presentations. PJ is unashamedly a free market organisation, so whether that falls into your definition, Charles, of rational economics, I'm not sure, but that's what I'm particularly interested in, because I'm a biologist by training and a biochemist. I'm a student of complex systems, and having moved into economics, I'm naturally drawn to people like Hayek and the Austrian school, and I see, but the reason I say that is because I see them as people trying to understand the self-organising nature of an economy, and the economy and the ecosystem that you're talking about are both complex systems, and they're intimately connected. So I just wanted you to explore a little bit more, and I am reading your book, so you might have the answer to this, but I do note that you do compliment Friedman on one thing. So I'm just interested in what you actually mean by rational economics, because the examples you've given today, and I've read so far in the book, are actually mercantilism. So the tariffs in India are a classic mercantilism. The regulatory capture by people who want basically anti-competitive behaviour. So a lot of the examples you give, I would argue, are not free market rational economics. They're actually intrusions into that, preventing the spontaneous nature of the economy to actually function.
Thanks for that. First of all, my book isn't meant to be the great source of wisdom. It's mainly about laying down principles and wonderful examples on opening up issues like we've just heard. And certainly I'm not going to get into a discussion on economics, which you have a much better understanding than me. I guess what I mean by economic, and you're probably quite right about mercantilism, tariff barriers and all that sort of stuff. What I mean by economic rationalism is what we're seeing in the free trade driven approach, which is, maybe I'm a conspiracy theorist, but it's, as I said, people on the bottom of the chain, like farmers, don't seem to be the beneficiaries. It's allowing access by the big end of town to get past what were previous barriers. And we've seen it in Africa and everywhere else. They can, particularly in a place like America with a huge subsidisation, they can come in and kill the local producers. And I'm not arguing, I guess, for barriers, but the complete carte blanche, laissez-faire approach of that sort of, maybe that I'm using the wrong terminology, but that's, I guess, what I mean. And it's a philosophy that, as I see, that is totally disconnected to an ecological view of recycling. It's just profit focused at all costs in a way when you look at the behaviour of some of those big transnational companies. So maybe wrong terminology, but that's where I'm coming from anyway.
Okay, guys. Well, look, I'm really sorry that we have to wrap it up, but we've got a bus to Gin to get. Look, thank you all from within inside the department and from within the industry and elsewhere for coming along. We want to obviously keep this dialogue alive. We think that it is very important that we keep our finger on the pulse of regenerative agriculture and get the debate and interest going. So anyone, we will keep in contact. Any of our visitors here will that are interested in forming part of some of the networks that have been set up. We'd be happy to pass on your details. But thanks again, and and thanks very much to our speakers. It's been fantastic. We really appreciate you coming.